Good afternoon. I'd like to welcome you to the third and final lecture in the Asian Studies series on Greater India. We're honored today to have Professor Don Lopez from the University of Michigan. He has a long history of interest in Buddhism. And before I get into that, I would just like to say that this series is being brought to you with support from the Mitzi and Daniel Verne Fund for Asian Studies, and we're fortunate to have Mrs. Verne here today. Professor Lopez got his education, bachelor's through Ph.D. from the University of Michigan. He is a prolific editor and author. I dare not name his 16 or 17 works, but I will give you a sampling. He has Buddhism in Practice, an edited volume, Curators of the Buddha, an edited volume. Both of these came out from Scholarly Presses in 1995. Professor Lopez is, of course, from the popular point of view, probably best known for his book, Prisoners of Shangri-La, Tibetan Buddhism and the West, which was published in 1998. And in 1999 won the American Academy of Religions Award for Excellence in the Study of Religion. And it is through that book that I first came in touch with his writings. More recently, he has written the book, The Tibetan Book of the Dead, a biography. And he will be drawing on his research for that book in today's topic, Tibet, America, and the Book of the Dead.
Thank you very much for coming on this beautiful afternoon. In 2005, I received a phone call from a newspaper in New Jersey. The journalist had seen a press release about a new translation of the Tibetan Book of the Dead, and he thought he might write a story about it. I referred him to a recently published scholarly study of the Tibetan text, but he wondered if I could answer a few questions. Is the Tibetan Book of the Dead the most important work in Tibetan Buddhism? No, I said. Do all Tibetans own a copy? No. Have all Tibetans read it? No. Is it a work that all Tibetans have heard of? Probably not, I said. Before I had a chance to explain, the reporter, sounding somewhat bewildered, thanked me and hung up. In his 1915 essay, Thoughts for the Times on War and Death, Sigmund Freud wrote, quote, "It is indeed impossible to imagine our own death. And whenever we attempt to do so, we can perceive that we are in fact still present only as spectators." 4 years later, an American theosophist named Walter Evans Wentz, traveling in the Himalayas, chanced upon a Tibetan text and asked the English teacher at the Maharaja's boys' school in Gangtok, Sikkim, to translate it for him. What is known in the West as the Tibetan Book of the Dead is the product of their collaboration. The Tibetan work that was given this name by Evans Wentz is one of many Buddhist texts known by the title Pardo Trudru, which means liberation in the intermediate state through hearing. It belongs to the genre of Tibetan text called Dharma, or treasure. It's said to have been a work composed by the great Indian tantric master Padmasambhava, who visited Tibet in the 8th century. Knowing that his teachings would be needed in the distant future, Padmasambhava dictated books to his consort and scribe, the Queen of Tibet, and buried them, sometimes in a cave, sometimes in a lake, sometimes in a pillar, sometimes in the heart of a disciple yet unborn, to wait discovery when the time was ripe for their contents to be revealed to the world. He composed thousands of such works, and the work called Pardo Trudru, buried in the 8th century, had been unearthed in the 14th century. Evans Wentz would discover that Tibetan text in the 20th century, and burying it under prefaces, commentaries, introductions, and annotations, named it the Tibetan Book of the Dead. Since its publication in 1927, the book has been discovered by millions of readers in the West who have used it to do what Freud deemed impossible, imagine their own deaths. Once it had appeared in English with this title, the Tibetan Book of the Dead would go on to have its own series of discoveries in the West over the course of almost a century. 7 major reincarnations and several minor ones, 7 discoveries of the text, each somehow suited for its time, have occurred since 1919. Thus, from the time of its first incarnation in English, the Tibetan Book of the Dead has taken on a life of its own as a timeless spiritual classic, perhaps the most famous Buddhist text in the world, and certainly the most famous Tibetan text. This afternoon, I will try to briefly explain how this could have possibly happened. The appeal of the Tibetan Book of the Dead derived from the irresistible combination of 2 domains of enduring fascination, Tibet and death. At the time of its publication, Tibet, still a remote land in the high Himalayas, was regarded by many as a place of esoteric wisdom, long since lost elsewhere, but preserved there. Bounded on the south by the highest mountains in the world, at a time when mountains signified a cold and pristine purity, Tibet was imagined as a domain of lost wisdom. Tibet's geographical inaccessibility was not the only reason for this view. Of perhaps equal importance was the fact that Tibet had never come under European control, and as a result, many of the European fantasies about India and China, dispelled from these lands by colonialism, made their way across the mountains and became sited in an idealized Tibet. Evans Wentz himself never entered Tibet, which in 1919 was largely inaccessible to Westerners. He remained instead on the borderlands in India, left to imagine what lay beyond the snowy range. Even greater than the lure of Tibet is the eternal fascination with death. When Freud asserted that it was impossible to imagine one's own death, what he meant by death was the cessation of mental function. But in the Buddhism of Tibet, consciousness never ceases, but passes through birth, death, and in the intermediate state, or bardo, a Tibetan term that as a result of Evans Wentz's book can now be found in Webster's dictionary. That is, consciousness is reborn over and over again until the achievement of Buddhahood. Much of the allure of the Tibetan Book of the Dead can be attributed to the fact that it was the first work to offer an extended discussion of the Buddhist doctrine of death and rebirth to a large audience in the West, a doctrine elaborated in the Tibetan text with detailed descriptions of visions of peaceful and wrathful deities that appear in the netherworld between death and rebirth. This vision of the afterlife found a ready audience during a different intermediate state, the period between the 2 world wars. The late 19th century had been the heyday of spiritualism, where mediums claimed to contact the spirits of the departed. Spiritualism experienced a revival after the First World War, when so many sought to know the fates of their lost fathers, sons, brothers, and husbands. Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, for example, turned to spiritualism and sought to contact his son Kingsley, who died as a result of wounds suffered at the Battle of the Somme. 2 of Freud's own sons were serving in the German army at the time of his 1915 essay, Thoughts for the Times on War and Death. An ancient Tibetan text which described the post-mortem state in such precise and elaborate detail, and which explained that death was not an end, but a beginning, that death was indeed an opportunity for enlightenment, provided both fascination and comfort. Yet, beyond the historical exigencies of its publication, the Tibetan Book of the Dead has proved remarkably resilient in subsequent generations, gaining far more readers in its English version than the Tibetan text upon which it is based ever had in Tibet. And it has been put to a remarkable range of uses. It inspired Timothy Leary, Ralph Metzner, and Richard Alpert to publish The Psychedelic Experience, a manual based on the Tibetan Book of the Dead, in 1964, a work in which the traditional teachings on the journey from one lifetime to the next were adapted as an instructional manual for what was then called an acid trip. Their book is largely forgotten today, except among true devotees of the Beatles who know that the opening lines of Tomorrow Never Knows from the 1966 album Revolver come from Leary's book. Whenever in doubt, turn off your mind, relax, float downstream. Today, in addition to various translations, one can purchase an audio Tibetan Book of the Dead read by Richard Gere, a video dramatization of Tibetan Book of the Dead, including film footage from Ladakh and an animated depiction of the state between birth and death, narrated by Leonard Cohen. The Tibetan Book of the Dead, for reading aloud, has been adapted as a play. there's also a comic book version called The Comic Bardo Trudro. An hour-long documentary on the Tibetan Book of the Dead aired in January 2007 as the History Channel's Decoding the Past series. Our own journey this afternoon begins in America. In 1874, Henry Steele Olcott, a former journalist for Horace Greeley's New York Tribune, a Civil War veteran, and an attorney, went to Chittenden, Vermont to investigate paranormal events occurring in a farmhouse belonging to the Eddy brothers, who were said to be able to summon several spirits, including that of a Native American chief called Santum. There he met the Russian emigre and medium Helena Petrovna Blavatsky. Their shared interest in spiritualism, psychic phenomena, and esoteric wisdom led them to found the Theosophical Society in New York City in 1875. The goals of the society included the formation of a universal brotherhood without distinction of race, creed, sex, caste, or color, the encouragement of studies in comparative religion, philosophy, and science, and the investigation of unexplained laws of nature and the powers latent in humanity. For Blavatsky and Olcott, theosophy was an ancient wisdom that was the root and foundation of the mystical traditions of all religions. This wisdom had been dispensed over the millennia by a group of Atlantean masters called Mahatmas, or great souls. In the modern period, these masters, seeking to escape from the increasing levels of magnetism elsewhere in the world, had congregated in a secret location in Tibet. As Madame Blavatsky's disciple, A.P. Sinnett, explained in his famous book, Esoteric Buddhism, quote, "From time immemorial, there had been a certain secret region in Tibet which to this day is quite unknown to and unapproachable by any but initiated persons, and inaccessible to the ordinary people of the country as to any others, in which the adepts have always congregated. But the country generally was not in the Buddha's time, as it has since become the chosen habitation of the Great Brotherhood, much more than they are at present were the Mahatmas in former times distributed around the world. The progress of civilization, engendering the magnetism that they find so trying, had, however, by the date with which we're now dealing, the 14th century, already given rise to a general movement towards Tibet on the part of the previous dissociated occultists." End quote. Madame Blavatsky, who during her youth had spent summers in the Kalmyk region of Russia, between the Black Sea and the Caspian Sea, a region which had a large Mongolian Buddhist community, claimed that prior to coming to America, she'd studied under the tutelage of the Mahatmas in Tibet over the course of 7 years, and that she remained in psychic communication with them, especially two masters, one called Kut Humi and the other called Master Morya, sometimes through dreams and visions, but most commonly through letters that either materialized in a cabinet in her room or which she transcribed herself through automatic writing. The Mahatma's literary output was prodigious, conveying instructions on the most mundane matters of the society's functions, as well as providing the content of the canonical texts of the society, such as A.P. Sinnett's Esoteric Buddhism and Madame Blavatsky's own magnum opus, The Secret Doctrine. The Theosophical Society enjoyed great popularity in America, Europe, and India, playing an important but ambiguous role for Hindu nationalism in India and Buddhist nationalism in Sri Lanka. Its popularity continued after the death of its founders and into the 20th century when Blavatsky's heir, Annie Besant, selected a young Hindu boy in 1909 as the Messiah, the world teacher, Krishnamurti. Krishnamurti would renounce his divine status and break with the society in 1930. Walter Ealing Wentz was born in Trenton, New Jersey on February 2nd, 1878. His parents were members of the Baptist Church of Trenton, but would break with the organized church to turn to free thinking and spiritualism. Walter took an early interest in spiritualism, reading as a teen both Isis Unveiled and The Secret Doctrine by Madame Blavatsky. In 1894, he left high school after 2 years and began working as a journalist after taking courses in business in Trenton and in Jacksonville, Florida, where his family owned rental properties. He eventually followed his family to Southern California, where he joined the American section of the Theosophical Society in 1901 at the headquarters of Point Loma, headed by Catherine Tingley, known as the Purple Mother. He received a diploma from the Raja Yoga School and Theosophical University in 1903, At Tingling's urging, he enrolled at Stanford, where he majored in English. In 1903, William Butler Yeats visited Stanford as part of his American tour. Inspired by Yeats' lectures on Irish fairies, Wentz became interested in the influence of Celtic folklore on English literature. Yeats had himself joined the esoteric section of the Theosophical Society in 1888, the same year that he published Fairy and Folk Tales of the Irish Peasantry. He was expelled by Madame Blavatsky 2 years later. In the spring of Wentz's senior year, 1906, William James was a visiting professor at Stanford. Wentz attended his lectures, perhaps finding in them confirmation of his theosophical belief in a common core to religious experience. After earning an MA in English in 1907, Wentz went to Europe, studying Celtic folklore in England, Ireland, and France. He received a doctorate from the University of Rennes in Brittany in 1909 and a Bachelor of Science in Anthropology from Oxford in 1910. One of his examiners was the great Andrew Lang. It was during this period that Walter Wentz, perhaps seeking to sound more British, began using his mother's family name and became Walter Evans Wentz. In 1911, Oxford published Evans Wentz's work on folklore entitled The Fairy Faith in Celtic Countries. It was dedicated to two Irish authors, each of whom had deep interest in theosophy and the occult world. The first was George William Russell, a poet, painter, and Irish nationalist who published under the pseudonym A.E. The other was Yeats, quote, who brought to me at my alma mater in California the first message from fairyland, and who afterwards in his own country led me through the haunts of fairy kings and queens. According to Buddhist legends, Buddhism entered Tibet during the reign of the 28th king, who likely lived in the 5th century CE. By this time, Tibet was surrounded by Buddhist cultures: India and Nepal to the south, Kashmir and Afghanistan to the west, China to the east. Yet, according to the story, Buddhism entered Tibet from none of these directions, arriving instead from above, when a casket of texts fell onto the roof of the royal palace. The king opened the casket and examined the texts, but finding them illegible, because Tibet did not have a written language at this time, he resealed the casket, dubbed it the sacred secret, and left it for future generations to read. 5 generations later, in the 7th century, the 33rd king of the dynasty, Sonsen Gampo, received Buddhism from the east and the south. As a result of treaties he received as wives, first a Nepalese princess and then a Chinese princess. Both were Buddhists, and they converted their husband. He built temples in Lhasa to house the statues of the Buddha that they brought from their homelands. And he sent a delegation to India to learn Sanskrit and then return to invent an alphabet for Tibetan in order that the teachings of the Buddha could be translated. And so began what the Tibetans call the early spread of the Dharma. The building of temples and the translation of texts began in earnest under the patronage of the 38th king, Trisong Detsen, who ruled the Tibetan Empire over the last half of the 8th century. In order to establish the first Buddhist monastery in Tibet, he invited the great Bengali master Shantarakshita, former abbot of the great Nalanda monastery in northern India. But impeded by various natural disasters and the protestations of local priests, he urged the king to invite a renowned tantric master named Padmasambhava from India, actually from Odhyana, which we now place somewhere in the Swat Valley in northern Pakistan, saying that he would be able to dispel the obstacles to the monastery's establishment. Padmasambhava accepted the invitation and succeeded in subduing the local spirits. Together, the king, the abbot, and the adept founded Samye, the first Buddhist monastery, and 7 young Tibetans were ordained as the first monks. Buddhism flourished, and more monasteries were founded, numerous masters invited from India, and hundreds of Sanskrit sutras translated into Tibetan. Royal patronage came to an end with the ascent of the evil king Langdharma, who is said to have closed monasteries and defrocked monks and nuns. He was assassinated by a Buddhist monk in 842, and the Tibetan monarchy came to an end. According to later historians, Tibet plunged into almost 2 centuries of political chaos and religious corruption, which ended only when a pious prince in western Tibet sought to restore the Dharma by sending a group of 21 young men into India to bring back Buddhism. Only 2 returned alive. and also by inviting the great Bengali master Atisha to come from the monastery of Vikramashila. These events marked for the Tibetans the beginning of the later spreading of the Dharma. This period was one of extensive spiritual traffic between India and Tibet, with Tibetans making the perilous trip across the Himalayas, returning as tantric initiates bearing texts and lineages. As Buddhist institutions in India came under threat from Muslim armies, Indian masters also made the journey north. The major sects of Tibetan Buddhism arose during this period. These were the Gadam, associated with Atisha. When Tsongkhapa established what came to be known as the Geluk in the 15th century, he called it the New Gadam. The Gagyut traced its origins to the 3 trips made to India by Marpa, the translator, the teacher of Milarepa. The third sect was the Sagyat, which traced its origins to the Indian master Virupa, and was named after its monastery, Grey Earth, Sagyat. The fourth sect called itself Ancient, Nyingma. It did not trace itself to pilgrimage to India or recently arrived Indian masters. It did not invoke oral instructions passed from master to disciple, unbroken by the passage of time. Instead, it looked to the distant past and to the written word. The history of the ancient kings that I've just described was not recorded until centuries after the events it claims to recount. And subsequent scholarship has called into question the existence of the Nepalese princess, as well as the piety of Sonsen Gampo. It's unclear whether Padmasambhava was even a historical figure. Recent scholarship suggests that if he was, his contribution to Tibetan culture was the introduction of certain irrigation techniques. But for reasons that are not entirely clear, over the subsequent centuries, he underwent an apotheosis, transformed into Guru Rinpoche, the precious guru, by far the most famous of Indian masters who may have ventured into Tibet. According to the later chronicles, the king of Tibet had been his devoted disciple. The queen had been his tantric consort. Long before the persecution of the Dharma, Padmasambhava had departed for the copper-colored mountain located on the island of Lanka, where he lives today in his octagonal palace called Lotus Light. But before doing so, he's said to have written or dictated thousands of texts on yellow paper in a coded script and hidden them inside pillars, in mountains, in lakes all over Tibet. These were teachings, it is said, that the Tibetans would need at a specific time in the future. Often the texts themselves contained a prophecy. Thus, in the 11th century, as the new sect of Tibetan Buddhism claimed authority by going to India to retrieve Indian texts, the ancient sect, or so it would later be designated, began to discover its own authoritative texts, Indian texts, or at least composed by an Indian master, without having to go to India. The texts had been concealed in the Tibetan landscape centuries before. Such texts were called Dharma, treasures. Many of the most influential instructions on death, the intermediate state, and rebirth belong to the genre of the treasure, including the book that we know as the Tibetan Book of the Dead. And so, centuries before, at the court of King Tisong Detsen, Padmasambhava is said to have made a prophecy. He predicted that in the coming degenerate age, virtuous deeds will only provoke resentment. Monks will break their vows of celibacy, and the world will descend in factionalism and strife. At this time of turmoil, special instructions will be necessary to prevent beings from falling into negative rebirths as animals, ghosts, and hell beings. Padmasambhava then declared, quote, "So to benefit the sentient beings of this degenerate age, I've committed this cycle of teachings to writing and concealed them at Mount Gambodar. In this age, a supremely fortunate son will be born. His father will have the name accomplished master Ninda, and he will be the courageous Karmalingba. On his right thigh there will be a mole resembling the eye of pristine cognition, and he will be born in the year of the dragon or snake, into a heroic family line, the fruit of his past good actions. May that fortunate person encounter this teaching. But he, Karmalingba, should not publicly teach the cycles of the peaceful and wrathful deities to anyone at all, even by whispering into the wind. And so it should remain until the time of the third lineage holder. Obstacles will arise if the teachings are publicly taught. However, he should impart the cycle of the great compassionate one to all his fortunate students. These treasures will be extracted in the region of Dakbo in southern Kongbo, and they will be concentrated for the sake of living beings in the range of Draklong in upper Kongbo, Karmalingba's activities on behalf of living beings will ripen in the north. End quote. Uncannily, everything in Padmasambhava's prophecy came true. Thus, in accordance with the prophecy, around 1350, a son was born to a treasure revealer named Yindaseng Sangye. The child's name was Karmalingba. At the age of 15, he engaged in practices necessary for him to discover textual treasures himself. The revealers of treasure are regarded as reincarnations of Padmasambhava's own disciples, students to whom he personally bestowed tantric initiation. In order to find the treasure, it was said to be necessary for the reincarnated student to manifest the mind of clear light, the same state of mind that Padmasambhava had revealed to the previous incarnation centuries before. The mind of clear light manifests at death, but it also manifests during orgasm. The discovery of treasure is therefore often preceded by the practice of sexual yoga with a consort. That consort, however, is also predestined for her partner, in some cases named in a prophecy by Padmasambhava or by his consort. But in the case of Karmalingba, something went wrong. He chose the wrong woman who bore him a son. Despite the apparent mismatch, Karmalingba successfully extracted 2 treasure texts from Gambodar, assisted by his father. The first was called The Peaceful and Wrathful Deities. The second was entitled The Great Compassionate One. He already had a circle of disciples to whom he bestowed the teachings of the second text while restricting the teachings of the first to a single disciple. He's also said to have produced a digest of yogic teachings from the discovered texts, which he entitled Instructions on the 6 Bardo, Pardotrukti. But his failure to find the appropriate consort bore bitter fruit. According to one account, his consort ran away with his attendant, only to return with him to poison Karmalingba. Knowing that he was dying, Karmalingba attempted to save himself through a practice called consciousness transference, or chongjuk, literally means entering a corpse, a practice at which his father was adept. Asking his father to watch over his body for 3 days, he caused his consciousness to enter the body of a dead bird. The bird then came back to life and flew to a distant mountain where the antidote to the poison grew. Just as the bird was returning to Tibet on the 3rd day, Karmalingba's evil attendant and his consort insisted that the body be cremated. The bird descended on Karmalingba's corpse and was about to deposit the healing fruit in his mouth when it was attacked by the attendant. The bird flew away, and the fruit, the magic fruit, burned in the flames together with Karmalingba's body. Among the many biographies of the great treasure revealers of the Nyingmapa sect, that of Karmalingba is one of the less glorious. His untimely death left much undone. His father and his son are said to have found among his possessions various manuscripts, some finished, some not, connected with a series of funeral rites that would become known as the Pardotrudro, liberation in the intermediate state through hearing. The task of consolidating those texts, as well as the treasures that he discovered, seems to have fallen to Karmalingba's son and to his son's disciple. They likely played a central role in the creation of the work that would eventually come to be known through a series of transformations as the Tibetan Book of the Dead. After completing his thesis, Evans Wentz began a world tour financed by the income he received from his family's rental properties in Florida. He was in Greece when the First World War broke out and spent most of the war in Egypt, where he studied ancient Egyptian religion as well as Coptic Christianity. In 1917, he traveled to Sri Lanka and then to India, where he would spend the next 5 years. He visited the Theosophical Society headquarters in Adyar in Madras. He met Annie Besant, who'd become president of the society after the death of Colonel Alcott in 1907. In the subsequent decade, Besant had turned the focus of the society away from Buddhism and toward Hinduism. From Madras, Evans Wentz continued up the east coast of India to Puri in Orissa, where he studied with various Hindu gurus, especially Swami Satyananda. In 1919, he arrived in Darjeeling in the Himalayas of West Bengal, a hill station established by the British East India Company in the previous century. In 1888, as a result of the first British invasion, a trade route between Tibet and India had been constructed through the district, and there was now a substantial Tibetan community in the region. Evans Wentz was a great collector of texts in languages that he never learned to read. He amassed a collection of Pali palm leaf manuscripts while in Sri Lanka, for example. Shortly after his arrival in Darjeeling, he bought some Tibetan texts from Major Campbell, a British Army officer who just returned from Tibet. These were portions of The Peaceful and Wrathful Deities by Karmalingba, provided with a letter of introduction from the local superintendent of police, Sardar Bahadur Ladanla, with whom he would later collaborate on another volume. Evans Wentz took these texts to the English teacher at the Maharaja's Boys' School in Gangtok, the capital of Sikkim, one Kazi Dawa Samdrup. Dawa Samdrup was already acquainted with Western enthusiasts of Buddhism, having served as translator for Alexandra David Neal, who herself had received her Theosophical diploma in 1892. She described him in her most famous book, Magic and Mystery in Tibet, and I quote, "Drink, a frequent failing among his countrymen, has been the curse of his life. This increased his natural tendency to anger and led him one day within an ace of murder. I had some influence over him while I lived in Gangtok. I persuaded him to promise total abstinence from fermented beverages that is enjoined on all Buddhists. But it needed more energy than he possessed to persevere." I could tell many amusing stories about my good interpreter, some quite amusing in the style of Boccaccio. He played other parts than those of a cultist, schoolmaster, writer, but peace to his memory, I do not wish to belittle him. Having acquired real erudition by persevering efforts, he was sympathetic and interesting. I congratulate myself on having met him and gratefully acknowledge my debt to him, end quote. Evans Wentz took his text to Kazi Dawa Samdrup over the course of the next 2 months, meeting with him each morning before the school day began. The translations that Kazi Dawa Samdrup made for Evans Wentz would eventually appear in 3 books: the Tibetan Book of the Dead, Tibetan Yoga and Secret Doctrines, and the Tibetan Book of the Great Liberation. Their time together was brief, with Evans Wentz soon returning south to Swami Satyananda's seaside ashram in Puri to practice yoga, learning to sit motionless for 4 hours and 40 minutes each day. Evans Wentz studied with several of the prominent Neo-Vedantin teachers of the day, including Satyananda's teacher, Sri Yukeshwar, as well as Ramana Maharshi. He returned to Gangtok to visit Kazi Dawa Samdrup in 1920. Shortly before, Kazi was appointed to the post of lecturer in Tibetan at University of Calcutta. This was to be their last meeting. Kazi Dawa Samdrup 22. In 1924, Evans Wentz returned to visit his family in Kalimpong, from whom he received a manuscript translation of the Jitung Kabung, the 100,000 words of Milarepa, which Evans Wentz subsequently edited and published as this classic work, Tibet's Great Yogi Milarepa, 1928. Evans Wentz seems never to have been a devotee of Tibetan Buddhism. Of his relationship with Kazi Dawa Samdrup, Evans Wentz's biographer writes, quote, "The few letters that have survived that they exchanged show a surprisingly distant and formal tone. Even in Dawa Samdrup's diaries, there's no word to suggest otherwise. There's nothing at all foreshadowing the later declarations that the Lama was the guru of Walter Evans Wentz, nothing about the teachings that the American was supposed to have received." Evans Wentz returned to the United States in 1941 and spent the last 23 years of his life at the Keystone Hotel in San Diego. He spent his final months at the Self-Realization Fellowship of Swami Yogananda, a disciple of Sri Yukeshwar and author of the popular work Autobiography of a Yogi in Encinitas. Walter Evans Wentz died in 1965, just as the Tibetan Book of the Dead was reborn yet again for a new generation of readers. Almost 4 decades after its publication, the Tibetan Book of the Dead remained one of the few Tibetan texts available in English translation. It, or excerpts from it, was used in college classrooms, sometimes anthologized in collections of Buddhist scriptures and Asian texts. Along with the Bhagavad Gita and Tao Te Ching, it entered the canon of classics of Oriental mysticism for readers once again seeking the wisdom of the East. In the late 1960s, Evans Wentz's old book found yet another audience as new fascination with death swept across the United States. No longer simply an exemplar of Asian wisdom, it became a world spiritual classic. In 1969, Elizabeth Kubler-Ross published the best-selling On Death and Dying, a handbook for the dying and their loved ones. This was the first of many books that she would write on the subject. In her 1975 book, Death, the Final Stage of Growth, she offered praise to Eben Wentz's book, quote, "The various Buddhist teachings concerning death and the most efficacious way of living toward death are presented in a most imaginative manner in the book, which is currently purchased by more people in the Western world than any other work, with the possible exception of the Bible, namely the Tibetan Book of the Dead." What is known in Tibet as the Pardotrodro is not a single text, but rather a cycle of texts. The number of texts in the cycle varies. They're often between 15 and 20, which are in turn drawn from the much larger cycle of Karmalingba's peaceful and wrathful deities. The block print of the text that Eben Wentz purchased from Major Campbell had 17 individual texts. Eben Wentz also had in his possession 3 other related texts. The first 2 were a short set of prayers in 2 editions, which according to Eben Wentz were not included in the block print. Finally, Kazidao Sandrup had his own manuscript of the text, which according to Eben Wentz corresponded to 7 chapters of the block print and included these same prayers. In his study of the history of the Tibetan Book of the Dead, Brian Cuevas has examined 21 editions of the Karmalingba cycle. Among the dozens of texts that occur, he identifies 3 as central to the performance of Tibetan funeral rites for the Nyingmapa. Of these, one is clearly the most important, appearing in 20 of the 21 extant editions. It is entitled The Liturgy for the Self-Liberation of Karmic Tendencies, the Churjit Pakcharongdro. Eben Wentz mentions this work in a footnote, mistranslating the title, but he does not translate the work that is most commonly read to the Tibetan dead. Instead, from the 17 texts of the book he published, 7 were chosen for translation, consisting of 3 chapters of instruction and 4 prayers. Of the 3 texts of instruction that Eben Wentz did select from the larger collection for translation, the Nyingmapa tradition has generally regarded the first and third as meditation manuals to be employed by advanced tantric practitioners rather than as mortuary instructions to be read to the ordinary dead. They are not part of a typical Tibetan funeral. The irony, in the event that yet another was needed, is that Eben Wentz selected 2 texts for the living and called them the Tibetan Book of the Dead. Thus, Eben Wentz, at least from the perspective of their long history in Tibet, selected the wrong text for translation. And then he dwarfed that translation with various introductions, forewords, commentaries, appendices, and footnotes. The translation became a code to be deciphered using the cipher of another text that is somehow more authentic. For Eben Wentz, the ur-text is Madame Blavatsky's The Secret Doctrine. Itself, her decoding of the stanzas of Dzan in the secret Senzar language, a work that she claimed to have received from the Mahatmas in Tibet. It seems then that Eben Wentz knew what he would find in the Tibetan text before a single word was translated for him. It almost seems that Eben Wentz's spiritual vacation could have taken him to any Asian country and that he could have chosen randomly any Asian text and he would have produced some version of the text published in 1927. But he chose Tibet, and thus it is the Tibetan Book of the Dead. One must recall how important Tibet was for theosophy as the secret abode of its imaginary Mahatmas, who were not Tibetan and whose existence was unknown to all but a few select Tibetans. The Tibetans, according to the Theosophists, practiced a debased form of Buddhism. Like the inhabitants of James Hilton's Lamasery of Shangri-La, the Mahatmas were not Tibetan. In Hilton's Lost Horizon, the happy Tibetans lived far below the Lamasery in the Valley of the Blue Moon. But ironically, Eben Wentz was, in his own way, also being traditional. For, as we recall, the Tibetan work called Pardotrodro is a treasure text, a Dharma, said to have been written long ago, in the 8th century, but intended for a future time. So it was hidden away, only to be discovered 6 centuries later. Even then, it was revealed to its discoverer in the secret Dakini language, a kind of code that only he was able to decipher and translate into the public language of Tibetan. It was necessary then for the discoverer, finding the text at the prophesied moment, to become a kind of embodied ghostwriter, translating it in such a way as to make it meaningful for its time, creating a text whose originality is derived from the fact that it is already a copy. And so the text has come back to life in various historical moments. For the Anglophone world, that moment was 1927. Had the reporter stayed on the line in 2005, I would have explained why my answer to each of his questions was no. I would have told him that the work by Walter Evans Wentz, entitled The Tibetan Book of the Dead, is not really Tibetan, it's not really a book, and it's not really about death. It's about rebirth, the rebirth of souls, and the resurrection of texts. Evans Wentz's classic is not so much Tibetan as it is American, a product of American spiritualism. Indeed, it might be counted among its classic texts. I would have told him that the Tibetan Book of the Dead is a remarkable case of what can happen when American spiritualism goes abroad. Thank you.
Professor Lopez will answer questions.
Absolutely, sure. Mm-hmm.
And we have a microphone to pass around. Question?
It's on?
Yeah.
Is it on? I don't.
It's not. It's just for the video.
Oh. I feel like I'm asking Carlos Castaneda this question. But what do you really think of it?
Well, it's obvious. There's many things to say, of course. One is that the translation is very good. That Kazidawa Samdrup was a very skilled translator from Tibetan into English long, long ago when many people could not do that. And so that's an important contribution. I do think that if Evans Wentz had not purchased the Tibetan book, the text from Major Campbell in 1919, that we probably would have not translated those texts even by now. They're that difficult, they're that esoteric in their own way. And they're also not that important to the tradition. And so it's just a strange tale of this circumstance of the book that he buys in the bazaar in Darjeeling, which then becomes the most famous Tibetan book in the world. I do fault Evans Wentz for the way that he reads the text. That is, he ascribes to the Tibetan tradition things which are absolutely not there. That is, he plants theosophical teachings in Tibetan Buddhism in a way which I think is probably well-meaning but perhaps irresponsible. It has to be said also that with works like The Third Eye, it's done more to inspire scholarship in Tibetan Buddhism than anything else.
But I guess as a follow-up, I once worked at the American Museum of Natural History in New York City. I was a docent in the Hall of Mexican Archaeology, the docent in the hall right below me of Native American was in fact a Yaqui Indian. Mm-hmm. And of course in 1977 or 8 or so, the question of the moment was, what does a Yaqui Indian really think of Carlos Castaneda?
Right.
He said, it's spot on. He said, those anthropologists have never found anything in my culture, but Carlos Castaneda did. Mm-hmm. So that's actually my question. Is there anything worth thinking about in this? Yeah,
well, I mean, I've certainly
never...
Does it
have profundity?
The Tibetan text itself have profundity? Definitely. But the text is about 30% of the book. The rest are footnotes, introductions, appendices, Evans Wentz burying the Tibetan translation under his own interpretations, so it must be unearthed from that. I've never heard a Tibetan say that Evans Wentz's work is spot on. However, it is the case that those very same chapters that were rather randomly chosen have been translated again and again as the Tibetan Book of the Dead by Tibetans who know better. Yeah.
Hi, I enjoyed your presentation. This is somewhat related to the earlier question. It's perhaps a methodological question.
Yeah.
And it concerns sort of where you see Buddhist studies or Asian studies perhaps today. There's the moment, Orientalism, the moment in which for 80s and 90s people basically were saying they're interested in showing how Western appropriations of Eastern texts were basically projections from the West onto those. And so it was this curious phenomenon in which the West can sort of interpret the East, but the East is not allowed to affect the West.
Right.
And recently, it seems that there's been a resistance to that model of interpretation. And so I'm wondering, to phrase the question to your presentation more precisely, is it the case that there is some resistance in that 30%, or does that count? Can that count as a kind of transmission, or as a kind of real influence? In other words, I just want to put some pressure on your characterization that it's not a book and it's not Tibetan.
Well, so it's not a book because the 17 texts, several were randomly chosen, so it does not represent the Tibetan book. Is not rendered into English, and so it's not a book. That there's not a one-to-one correspondence in that sense. Certainly, the translation, as I said, is quite strong and has inspired many people. But because it has to be sort of filtered through Evans-Wentz's lens, that's produced a certain element of which I think, frankly, be distortion. I don't think it's just another way to see things. I think it's actually a pretty willful misreading of the tradition, which he then reads back into something that he said he heard from Tibetan Lamas, which he certainly did not. And so, yeah, I mean, this is a moment that we deal with, right? This is a text that has inspired many of my colleagues to become Tibetologists, just like the Third Eye, which we know is even more of a fraud, and much more of a fraud than Evans-Wentz's text. And so we just have to understand that history and then take it from there. I think that's the best we can do.
Is there a published edition of the 17 texts together?
Yeah, it just came out in 2005. So Penguin finally did the complete translation of the Tibetan Book of the Dead. It's a very good translation, so that's finally out there, almost 75 years after Evans-Wentz's work. So it is the case that I think in order to capitalize on the fame of Evans-Wentz's work, people just took those exact same chapters and retranslated those over and over again until 2005. A team got together and did the big entire text, which is quite a masterful and impressive piece of work. So yeah, that's available. Penguin Classics.
Can I ask a quick follow-up?
Yeah, sure.
I'm a practicing Tibetan Buddhist, and I've noticed that when I go to look for texts, all I can find are the most advanced teachings that I would never get until I'd had years and years of study. And when I talk to lamas, they laugh about that a lot because there's a prescribed, like a path.
Right.
What have you talked to any Tibetans? What do they think about the availability of such an advanced text to everybody? And are they surprised that it's been so effective and embraced?
Well, the Dalai Lama addresses this question of the translation of secret texts in the introduction to a book called Tantra in Tibet, published in the 70s. And he says that he has some fear that the world will become kind of a spiritual marketplace, but he also says that it's probably more important to put out good translations of these works if those can be done. So, but it is the case that there is this kind of American Buddhism that has come into existence over the past century. And one of the things that American Buddhists want to do is to do all the things that monks do, except keep that vow of celibacy. And that is to study the highest levels of Buddhist philosophy, to read tantric texts, to receive these initiations, and to do the most advanced forms of meditation, which in general were not done by lay people in Tibet or in any Buddhist country. Buddhist laity traditionally have just given gifts to monks and nuns. That's their practice. And so there's been a strange kind of transposition of the monastic, actually the elite monastic mode, onto everyday American Buddhists over the past 50 years or so. Yeah. That's happened in the Tibetan case as well, of course.
Yeah. I think Shunryu Suzuki also.
Yeah, mm-hmm. Yeah, right.
Thank you for your interesting talk, really. Can you make a generalization about Tibetan funerary practices? Do Tibetan people in general read a book? Not necessarily the one you described. Do they read the 17 chapters of the Book of the Dead, for example? We know that they have a certain a ceremony of 49 days, for example.
Right.
But uniformly across Tibet, people have a consistent funerary practice.
Well, I mean, they have a consistent practice in the sense that they believe that their loved one is departed and is going to be spending anything between 1 second to 49 days in the bardo, and so that period is very important for getting them into a good place of rebirth. Of course, most Tibetans can't read, and so they would call in a monk or lama sometimes to read a text or read some prayers over the corpse. But I think the way that the 17 texts, it's really 15 to 20 texts, were used in Nyingmapa, this was just kind of a number of texts that a lama could draw from in a given circumstance. Is it a long ceremony for a wealthy person? Then you read more. If it's something short that's got to be done on the run, then you just read these two. And so it was really just kind of something that would be part of the repertoire, I think, of the funeral master in a given, for Nyingmapas and also to Gagyu to some extent, right? But these texts would not be used in Sagya or Geluk, these particular ones. Yeah, right.
Well, thank you very much.
Thank you. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yep. Thanks.